And joining us now is Karl Moore, a business professor from McGill University. Always nice to see you. Welcome back.
Pleasure to be here, Tom.
Your Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, was on the world stage just recently in Washington for an official visit. His visit got a lot of press, but did it, in the eyes of Canadians, accomplish much?
Well, something where as Canadians, we're just proud that the world and America cares. We're 1/10 the size of the U.S. You're much more important, without a doubt. And so it's kind of cool when we have someone who's seen as being very interesting to the world and to the President of the United States. So we all feel proud, regardless of political stripe. I think he accomplished something in terms of the environment, probably move forward some of the issues around softwood lumber, some of the other issues that have been irritants between the two countries, and security at the border. So from our viewpoint, just the fact that Americans are aware of us and Congress people and senators are aware of our issues, that's a substantial contribution.
Oil is a major export for Canada. He supported and probably continues to support the idea of the Keystone XL pipeline, but is there any hope that that may be revived with the next administration?
Well, we'll see what happens down here in the U.S. and their view of the environment. From a viewpoint, even in Quebec, there's been a lot of concern about a pipeline going across Canada. But it's so important for our economy, and environmentally versus moving it by trains, as we saw a disaster a couple years ago in Quebec, that it's a mixed story, and I'm not sure how we'll sort out. But that's certainly, if we can get the Keystone working in the U.S., that would be great from a Canadian viewpoint.
If that doesn't happen, and yes, you mentioned in the works now is the Energy East pipeline, a 3,000-mile pipeline to bring the oil from Alberta through Ontario, Quebec to New Brunswick. Is that running into some resistance now? Is that becoming a little more controversial?
There's been a lot of concern in Quebec about it, some in Ontario as well. So it's clearly an issue which it's somewhat pitting the East against the West, and is a mixed story where what the Prime Minister's talked about is let's make sure that we go through all the clearances and do the right kind of approvals and task force looking at it, which by definition will slow it down, which is not please people out West. So bit of a political time bomb.
And we talk about rail. One of the agreements coming out of Mr. Trudeau's visit to Washington was pre-clearance for customs. And that's been talked about for a number of years. And that would allow passengers to board a train in Montreal, Central Station in Montreal, and not have to stop at the border, which would shave off a good hour and a half. How big of a deal is that for Canadians? Do you think more Canadians would travel by train if the trip happened to be an hour and a half shorter?
I think that helps, but it's such a long trip between Montreal to New York, it takes like 10 hours. It's just so long, it's so not high speed. Albeit, going through this part of the country, it's beautiful. Maybe not in winter, but spring and autumn and summer, it's a gorgeous ride I've heard from people. So an hour and a half would help, but it's something where if you had a 4 or 5 hour, that would go, I'm gonna take the train, as you do to Toronto instead of flying sometimes. But that will help for sure.
Every year, you and students go on your Hot Cities tour. You take students from McGill, you travel to different parts of the world to look at their economies. Where did you go this year?
Went to Chile and Colombia. So we had 29 undergraduates, 1 graduate student, and 12 what I call inspiring alumni to come along the trip. So we had 12 days in Colombia and in Chile this year. Wonderful trip.
And why did you choose those countries?
Well, the slogan of the trip, Tom, is taking the future to the future. That is young people to where there's strong economic growth. So we've been to Israel, the UAE, India, South Africa, Russia, Mongolia and Seoul, and last year Doha, Hong Kong, Jakarta, and Bali. So looked at South America and said, in Latin America, where are there a couple countries that are seeing in quite good growth? And Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela are not doing well right now. Other countries are small, so Colombia and Chile were the choices, so it's indeed a small world. So we saw what kind of were some of the key players there to understand what their economies are doing, where they're going, and also understand how do you lead and manage in Latin America versus back home in North America.
Back to your Prime Minister, you interviewed him last summer. You do a series of interviews with CEOs and political leaders on radio interviews, and you talked with him last summer just a couple of days before the federal election was called. And as I mentioned, you've known him for a number of years, but at that point, he certainly didn't seem like the next Prime Minister.
No, absolutely. At that time, it was a couple days before they announced, he was in 3rd place. It looked like the NDP, astonishingly, may well become the party that rules and put Tom Mulcair forward as Prime Minister. Clearly, the Conservatives they were by their sell-by date. They had become long in the tooth, and the Canadian populace, by and large, wanted to move on from the Conservatives and Prime Minister Harper. But it was really up in the air, and the NDP at that point seemed to be leading So quite a turn of events.
He came from behind in the last few weeks and won. Were you surprised when he won in October?
Well, by that time the polls had switched, and I think what Canadians said, the NDP like some of their policies, appreciate what they're saying, but should they have the levers of power? And it appears that most Canadians said, no, I don't think so.
How's he been doing his first few months in office?
Well, it seems like, there's very much a honeymoon period. You have people that are very attractive family, some very attractive policies. Not everybody agrees, but there's some very nice policies about the Syrian refugees, things like that, where you got to go, this is Canada at its best, and we appreciate what he's doing. I think that, you get into the reality of politics sort of ruling. His popularity will go down now, but it's something where, at this point, has made some good decisions, some interesting appointments, but it'll be the ground game that he's going to have to play for a couple of years. That will probably cause him some popularity issues, but we'll see if he's a real leader in the context of a few years. But at this point, not so bad thus far.
When he was running, one of his campaign promises was that he would not build the new Champlain Bridge on the backs of motorists. He wouldn't rely on tolls to build that bridge. Is that a campaign promise he's going to be able to keep?
Well, campaign promises, some are going to be broken as events change. So maybe with a deficit and other financial pressures, he may have to back off on that promise. But that's one where it affects a lot of Montrealers. And it'd be hundreds of thousands of people. But this is one where it affects a lot of Quebecers day in and day out. And so it might be politically more damaging to give up on that promise. So I think reality sets in and people at a certain point allow that you got to break some of your promises. The question is which ones.